Now the way Corona works, it uses what's called the, the painter's model. The painter's model says that when you create object A and then you create object B later, and you put them in the same position, object B, because it was created later, will be rendered over the top of A. Basically, anything created later is always rendered over the top of things that are created before those things, if you don't layering. So, because display groups are themselves layerable objects, you can create them in a specific order, which will ensure their vertical layering. So for example, if you look at the code I'm showing here, I create a group called layers, another one called underlay, world, content1, etc., etc. And up to line 41, the way these are organized is layers is first, underlay is on top of that, world is on top of that, and so on and so forth. So to that point in the code where the painter's model has been enforced. Just a note, you'll notice that I created layers, which is a local variable at the top of the file. So I created a group and stored it in layers. And then I said layers dot underlay. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to pass this variable around in my code, but I want to have easy access to all these other display groups by name. So later, when I wanted to put an object in layers underlay, I could simply do this. Layers underlay. If I had a reference to this variable here, I could type layers underlay insert and whatever the object is that I wanted to insert into the group. So what I do for my own ease of programming is I will create one master group and then I will dot notate the names, give unique names to every other layer, and have a reference to them so that I can always refer to them by name. It just makes it easier to code, easier to understand later on when I'm looking at my code. So let me undo this change here. Got a little ahead of myself. All right. Okay, so at this point on line 41, we created a number of layers. They're organized in the painter's model, bottom to top, the creation order. Not what I want. What I really want is I would like to have underlay beneath world, world beneath overlay, and overlay on top of everything else. In addition to that, within the world group, I want to start creating a bunch of sublayers that each of them will be above underlay and below overlay. The other way you can control ordering in Corona is when you insert an object into a group, that object instantly becomes the topmost layer within that group. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying layers, and then I insert underlay, world, and overlay. So these are all now sorted. Underlay is on the bottom, world is on in the middle, and overlay being the last one is now on the top. Then I take content 1, 2, 3, and I insert them into the world. And what that gives me, I'm going to zoom way in here, is from bottom to top now, underlay is on the bottom, world is above that, and then within that group is content 1, 2, and 3, and finally on top of everything else is overlay. With this small set of groups, now I have a place to put my background images to ensure they're always in the background. I have a place to construct a layered world where I can put hallway elements and ensure that some are on top of others. For example, I'm going to put my player in content 3, but I'm going to build my hallway using content 1 and 2 because I want to have certain layering rules for the parts of the hallway.
So are we then the big benefit here is that we have a much more robust way of creating and managing the layers of our content? Is that what we're talking about? Or
yeah, absolutely. At this point, now we have a series of groups which we know exactly how they're organized from bottom to top, and when we put our objects into those groups, we always ensure the objects rendering relative to the other layers. Within a group, things will still be on top of each other and following the painter's model. But by doing this, we've simplified our creation rules greatly. And you don't have to worry about doing two front and two back and resorting things manually. All that goes away when you start using groups.
Okay. Yeah, mentally, again, I like to get a visual picture of these types of things. I'm looking at Photoshop, and I've created, 20 layers, and one of those layers is, a foot, and one of those layers is a head, and one of those layers is a, cloud, and I'm like, eventually you're like, oh, I don't, you start moving things around in order to get things in the right order, and it can really get confusing. So, in Photoshop, you create a group, and then you take and you stick all that, or which looks like a little folder. You stick all the related items into that group, and then now you're just managing the groups.
Now you've got a hierarchy.
Ordering of the groups. Yeah, now you have a hierarchy, and so I just want to make sure that everybody gets kind of a mental picture of what we're talking about and why we might want to do that, as opposed to just the default, like you said, putting everything into the one default group. So.
Yeah, that's exactly why I do it, because otherwise you're just trying to manage chaos, and it's very hard as your game has more and more objects in it to remember and to control what objects are visible on top of other objects. And in fact, it becomes impossible once you introduce interfaces to control things correctly. You need groups. It's worth mentioning that we did all this by hand, but all of this coding using, I have a tool in SSK which we're not going to use on this game. We'll use it in future games for creating custom layer layouts, and all you do is call the function and pass in names for the layers, and it produces them in the order that you pass in the names, and you can create grouped sublayers with this too. One depth of sublayers. So we could have created all of this in one line of code, but I wanted to demonstrate this time around the principle of it, and so you can look at the code and understand how this comes out in the end. So let's go to main.lua. If we go all the way to the bottom, our master module, which I mentioned last week, which is game, the first thing we do is game init. And then if we look at game init, we'll see a function in here called, on line 36, called public.init. And what this does, basically, is one of the first real pieces of work it does is it calls the layers module and tells it to create those layers, that bit of code that we just looked at. That function itself will return a reference to layers, which then we can use to initialize the other modules. Now, I haven't done it yet. We're going to uncomment code as we go along in our discussion here so you can start to see things happen. But on line 45, we would initialize the one-touch input and pass in layers because it's going to need to know about those layers. You can initialize the player module and pass in the layers because, again, it needs to know about these layers for rendering things. And finally, which we are going to leave uncommented at this point, we can initialize the walls module. So let's jump into what the walls module does, and then we'll come back here and start adding more things if we have time. So you'll recall that when I said that we were going to, let me get this running here, we were going to do this. What we want to do is we want to break down the wall drawing problem to something as simple as possible. And so to do that, we will draw lines initially to show you what we're trying to do, and then I will break it out into creating actual rectangles and moving them around and explaining how this works. Let me take a look at the initialization code. There's nothing that needs to be said here. All we do is take the layer that is passed in as parent and store it locally in a reference to layers, which is a local variable at the top of the file. Let me go back into game. Sorry here, I got a little discombobulated. One of the things is when we initialize our game, if you remember from the image, the starting screen has the player, but it's not moving. It has an initial long hallway that goes up from the bottom right to the top left, so it's a very long segment before it starts twisting. And so this is what we're trying to achieve. So when you initialize the game, one of the things it's going to do is it's going to set up all the layers, and it's going to tell the modules, it's going to initialize the modules, But then it's also going to need to start drawing these segments, the initial hallway segment, which is what we're going to create today. So on line 50, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to uncomment some code, which is going to draw a blue background so we have something better to look at. And when I do that, I'm going to put the blue background in the underlay so that it's below everything else. So now let's save that code. I have a little window over here which I'll make bigger later so you can see it, but I'll keep it small as we go along right now so we can see the code and the results at the same time.